Okay, well, welcome to Coffee with the Founder. I got my coffee cup here, and of course, we got a phenomenal guest joining us. Um, Christine, we're doing these Coffee with the Founders as a way to just introduce people to the WPC family community. And so let's start by asking you, who are you? What is your work? What do you do? I mean, how do you introduce yourself when you're out and about and people ask you who you are and what you do? How would you introduce yourself to the folks here this morning?
Well, good morning, Eddie. I also have my coffee, so thank you for this. And I'm really grateful and humbled that you asked me to be part of this process. For me, I'm clear that I'm a white woman who is working to really organize other white people in solidarity with and accountability to people of color to take more effective action in confronting racism. And I did that when I was in the classroom. I did that when I was facilitating for courageous conversations. And so now I'm trying to find different ways to do that while being safe and socially distancing.
Yeah. Now, I white solidarity seems like an oxymoronic term. What's
Yeah.
been your experience organizing white folks in solidarity around social justice, equity, so on and so forth?
I think that one of the hardest pieces is our attachment as a white community to individualism. And so we can be in all white spaces and be in solidarity around not talking about race really easily. That's what I was conditioned to do. That's what most of the white folks that I know and have grown up with, that's been their experience as well. And so part of it is interrupting that conditioning, I guess, and to really think of what does it mean to be in a loving, intentional, anti-racist space with other white people, and to do it in solidarity with and accountability to people of color. And so really getting, and I had to do this myself, really getting a sense of what does it mean for me to be connected to a white collective? What does it really mean for me to see myself as part of a white community and not just say it and not just intellectually examine it, but to feel it and then to feel it and live it.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned being in the classroom, and I'm wondering, in doing this work with young people, uh, I mean, I hate to use the term easier, but how was it different working with young people versus working with adults around the work that you do?
Well, I always joke, but it's also true that young people are much more charming learners than adults are.
Mm.
They're just much more open and they speak their truths more easily than I find working with adults. And so it's different. Is it always easier? No. When I was working with young people, there's so much of them, they're creating and forming and testing their identities in the moment. And so the ways in which they try on things and discard them is really different. And I think in particular working with white students, when they're kind of trying on some of that edgy, you're like, I'm not racist, but right, some of that edgy pieces, like that can be just as challenging as working with it in adults.
Now, I know you've been doing some work, and I saw during quarantine you're doing some work with some global students. So, talk a little bit about that. Like, I don't want to use easier, but how is it different working globally around some of these issues, especially with young people?
Yeah, well, I sent out a message as I found myself having, unfortunately, more free time and when I was laid off due to COVID-19. And so I really just reached out to folks via my social media and I said, listen, I could do things with students. I could help your students read, I can help them write, I could do social justice work. And I had a number of people reach out and say, oh, the social justice piece would be really interesting. And my first parent who started was for a 10-year-old. And so that was my first cohort that I started, was 9 to 11-year-olds. And I just opened it up. And so when I opened it up, I have friends in New Zealand who wanted their son to be involved, a young Maori man. And so it's been very getting to know each other over Zoom, of course, offers its own its own challenges. And I've been just really moved by their ability to be curious about each other. And so that's for the students within the US and for our student in New Zealand, and to just be real, to lean into that curiosity and really listen in ways that I was amazed that 9 to 11-year-olds will sit in front of a computer screen and listen. We have a multiracial group, so we have a number of students of color and white students. And so as we've been talking about different levels for them in terms of what is fair, what is not fair, and what is it different when it's in their family versus their community versus their school, and just their insights and ability to think about what does it really mean to treat others with fairness, and then how do we link that to this idea of justice. They've talked about historical pieces, they've talked about interpersonal pieces, and so that has been a great learning experience for me. I taught high school primarily when I was in the classroom. And so just being able to see what young people are capable of when we give them age appropriate space and tools to have the conversation. So it has honestly been something that's been giving me a lot of, sustenance, nourishment to get through COVID, to be able to work with young people again.
Yeah, and you mentioned age appropriateness, and I'm assuming, I mean, at least I feel like I'm often getting the question, I don't know if my kid is ready, Particularly, it's been interesting to see how people of color sometimes introduce their kids to these subject matters versus white folks. So when you're asked that question from white parents, particularly about age appropriate, when is the right time to begin this work with my kid?
Mm-hmm.
How do you respond?
I say right away, when they're a baby, right? It's forming when they're a baby. They talk about those studies where they can track babies' eyes and what faces they will spend more time on. And so just if you're a white baby and all you see are white faces, you're going to end up with a preference for white faces, right? And so there's so much good scholarship, right? So on one hand, just helping from the intellectual place, we love our data and we love our quantitative stuff. And to think about what does it mean to create and grow young, empathetic, anti-racist, social justice white students. And you can't do that if you don't have any of those conversations until they're 15 years old, because they've already formed their opinions, they've already formed their biases, and you're gonna have to do, just like with the adults, work so much more to undo the racism that's been built, versus if you're starting it younger, then it's already just a natural part of who I am as a white person is anti-racism and social justice. Jennifer Harvey's book, I just completely blanked on the name, Raising White Kids, I think, Raising White Children. That has been a great resource for me in thinking about myself as a teacher and an auntie and involved in young people's lives. And I recommend it all the time to white parents, because she does a really excellent job of giving concrete examples of what is appropriate for a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old. And it is different, and they're able to talk about those pieces. I do want to just go back to something that you said, I think is really important. I think that often I run into white parents who are like, oh, but they're so innocent, right? And you talk about the difference for parents of color, right? So when you're targeted by racism, that there's none of that privilege or ability to access that innocence because of what can happen. And so I really try to think about how to have that conversation with white parents and white folks who are responsible for young people about, kind of like I said earlier, about when you lay the groundwork early, it's easier to build it over the course, but it's also just that sense of what's right and what's just. And if we are not consciously, as white people, talking about race to our young people, there's lots of folks who are, and they're getting the wrong message. And so that's a really important piece, particularly now with the rise of white nationalist and white supremacist recruiting online. You know, in games that Fortnite people are playing, you know, at 8 years old, in those chat rooms, if you're not working to help protect your white student, somebody else is going to fill that void.
Yeah, yeah. I'd love to have you talk a little bit more about the work you're doing around white supremacy, white supremacist groups, and young people. Can you just give a sense of what that work is, who's involved, how you got involved, and really what's the status of extremist groups, young people, white supremacy, so on. Your kind of 30-foot overview in reference to that subject matter.
Yeah. So I'll start with how I got started, which was when I was in the classroom. I had a young white Jewish student of mine when we were doing an activity in class that was, you know, fairly low, what I thought was, you know, low risk in terms of talking about race in college essays. And he lost it. He was so angry, and he said, "I'm so tired of being taught to be guilty about being white." He's like, so much so that I could understand joining the alt-right, even though I'm Jewish. And I was like, oh my gosh. So number one, clearly we've been building white consciousness wrong. If this student is a senior and he thinks that he's supposed to feel guilty about being white, and we're pushing him towards white nationalism, like we've done something wrong. And so that really forced me to look at myself as a teacher and what I was doing, but then also to think about, what am I doing with my white collective to really take this seriously and to make sure that we're building white racial consciousness that can push through guilt and shame and other things that might come up and feel empowered, right? That there are things that I can do to be anti-racist and be white and not have to feel bad about it, as long as this, you know, social construction exists. So that prompted me on my own journey, because I myself had been really avoiding thinking about white nationalists and white supremacists and the alt-right because of my own background. I grew up in Pennsylvania in the 80s. I was in the punk rock scene, which was great for me, taught me a lot of good things, even being anti-racist. But that's because there was a really big neo-Nazi skinhead part of punk rock in the 80s. And there were active groups. I had a high school friend who took me to coffee to tell me he was joining this white supremacist group. And back then I didn't have any skills. I had been taught to be colorblind. I had been taught to not talk about race. So the best thing I could do is I was like, oh, hey, that sucks. And just like break off my relationship with him. Because I didn't have any racial literacy skills to have a conversation with him and maybe prevent him from joining a group like that. So that forced me to examine my own history and then start to ask questions about other white folks and how so few white people will own the fact that they have relationships with people who subscribe to white nationalist or white supremacist ideology. And I was like, that can't be true, right? Like that just can't be. Like, I know I have my own history. So like, what's that willful, this image, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but like willful pulling something over our eyes to not see it, to not say it, to not talk about it. And that's when I really started doing work. And you know, Shelley Touchluck, she and I really started doing work together to understand what the recruiting was and to start providing resources to white parents and parents of white children to really understand how the recruiting was happening. And then that prompted us to start connecting with folks across the country. Western State Center did that amazing interrupting white nationalism piece for schools, and just really starting to try to help folks connect the dots, white folks in particular, white community, to really connect the dots and to move into action. And I know you said the 30-foot version, so I'm sorry I talked so long.
Oh, that's so good. That's so good, because I'm wondering, you know, someone's listening. Someone wants to know, okay, if this group or these groups are on the rise, what can I do as a white parent especially? Yeah. So I want to ask you, if you were able to give a message to white parents who want to listen, what would be your message to them? But first, can you just talk about white nationalism, white supremacy groups, alt-right. Are those all synonymous terms? Do they all mean the same? Are they all the same?
Yeah, so it's interesting. In a lot of ways, yes, they are all the same. Because they're all dedicated to an idea that whiteness must be protected. Now, there's differing in their ideologies and their rhetoric around whether or not they would actually claim racism, right? So white supremacists, groups who identify as white supremacists, like they're clear, right? That Jews are orchestrating, a takedown of white people, and they're using people of color, in particular Black people often, and that scourge must be dealt with. So the white supremacists are clear that they're racists. The white nationalists and the alt-right will do a little more dancing in their rhetoric, right? And so you have a lot of white nationalist groups who'll be like, oh gosh, no, we're not racist. Like, we're not like white supremacists. We're just about taking care of our community. You know, the Black community takes care of itself. The Latinx community takes care of itself. So we have to take care of ourselves, right? So they use the same language almost as progressive left groups about identity, and like trying to take identity politics to justify their racism. And so the alt-right calls itself alt-right because that distances themselves even more from the idea that we're protecting, whiteness, or we're against whiteness. But there are plenty of alt-right groups that are also pretty blatantly racist. So I think that that's kind of that dance.
That's helpful. So what do you, you mentioned that these groups are active, on the rise. So I'm assuming you've had this question before. I mean, what are you saying to parents of white kids in reference to having some knowledge, some understanding, some competence around white nationalism, alt-right, white supremacist groups?
At the kind of starting point, if you haven't had any conversations at all, it's really recognizing two skill building things that have to happen together. And that's building racial consciousness. Your white children need racial literacy skills to be able to think and talk about race and racism in ways that are not just kind of made up out of the ether, right? That they're grounded in history, they're grounded in knowledge, right? So that there's the racial consciousness piece. And then it also has to be with digital literacy. And so knowing what your students are doing online, playing games with them online, asking them questions about what they're seeing, and doing it from a critical consciousness perspective. So that's where the racial consciousness piece is. You can't just do digital literacy, because students won't make the link between racism and what they're seeing, right? Anti-Semitism and what they're seeing. So that's that consciousness piece that has to be done together. And so for many white parents, that means I have to do my own work too, right? Because I may not have that many racial consciousness, racial literacy skills. I may not have many digital literacy skills. And so be humble and vulnerable and learn with your student. Be their partner in this. Support their critical consciousness. Support them and their ability to critique racist messages, to critique homophobic messages, to critique transphobic messages, and wrestle with them together.
Yeah, that's so good. I was going to ask you about the presence of these ideologies in our everyday interactions. Now, I think there's clear evidence that there are some of these folks in politics, in policing, even possibly in the hospitals as physicians and some of those kinds of high-ranking officials. But I want to speak to education. What's been your experience? I mean, are you seeing people with this kind of ideology in education? And if I'm a school principal and I'm hiring, what are some ways I can screen? I can kind of get a sense of maybe this is not the right place for you to be with that kind of thinking.
Yeah. Well, I think asking a question about racial consciousness in the interviewing process. And if somebody can't answer that question, or answers it with, I'm colorblind, I treat all my students the same, any kind of thing that takes me further away from actually examining how race impacts the lives of my children and how race impacts my life, I think that's a big signal. And yeah, unfortunately, as you named, just in any system or institution, there are white nationalists who are, and I'll be clear here, they're ones who are actively pursuing white nationalists. There was an arrest of a SRO, or he wasn't arrested, I apologize, let me misspoke. He was fired because they found out he'd been outed as an active white nationalist member. This is a school resource officer, right? Someone there supposedly to protect children who succumbs or subscribes to white nationalist ideology, right? And then you have kind of like the folks who wouldn't say, like, I'm not a white supremacist, I'm not a white nationalist, right? And yet will do things like that teacher in Texas who tweeted Donald Trump and said, please come arrest all the illegal, Hispanics in our school, right? Because they're dangerous, right? So she's espousing the ideology, but doesn't identify as the ideology. Yeah. And I think that that's becomes like the piece of being able to have conversations with folks and to not get caught up in the, okay, so yes, you're not part of a group. You don't, you're not in a Discord chat room having conversations, and yet you're perpetuating ideology. And that could be even as simple as what you have in your curriculum and what it says about white people and what it says politically, right? That's also furthering a white nationalist agenda. It's just not, you're not subscribing to a group.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you about money, white people, and diversity work. How do you respond when people talk about white people making money on diversity work? Have you faced this question? What's your sense of, kind of the discussion, the idea? I mean, how do you fall when people respond or people ask or people press you for some kind of response to white people shouldn't be making money off diversity work?
Yeah, I think that for me, that's a really important question. And again, to go back to the accountability piece that I opened with, and what does accountability mean for me? I think that there has to be an integrity to what I do. And so that means that there's an integrity to how I learn and how I show up and how I act and take action as a white person with other white folks and with people of color. I also know that I need to make a salary, right? And so how do I make a salary, which ostensibly is from racism, but do it with integrity? And so that has been about the quality of my work and engaging feedback on my work, in particular from folks of color. But then it's also financially making sure that I had my accountability relationships, that I donated part of my salary every year. I had a lot of monthly subscriptions to places like the Privilege Institute or the Black Youth Project in Chicago or Cure Violence. And that for me was part of making sure that I'm not opportunity hoarding and taking all the benefit for myself when I'm saying that I'm about ending racism and interrupting the system as it exists. It's not perfect, but it's the path that I've tried to live with some fidelity.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I feel like it's just one of those, using the old metaphor, elephant in the room when folks are around, consultants, or even at the conference, right? It's just something I don't think we're having enough, i.e., I'll quote our good friend Glenn Singleton, courageous conversations about. And as we know, the world's going to continue to need us doing this work. And so I appreciate you taking that on. I was wondering,
Eddie, can I say one more thing before you ask?
Yeah, please.
Because one thing another part of the accountability, and I think this is really important for white people to say to other white people, is I can't tell you how many folks I've had in sessions with me that I've been facilitating, white folks, who come up to me and say, Christine, like, this is amazing. I'm learning so much. How do I do this? Meaning, how do I become a facilitator who facilitates anti-racism work? And I think answering that question is really, really important, because what I say is the very first thing that you need to do is you need to go do your own work, right? I didn't start doing facilitating until 8 years after I started really engaging my own personal anti-racist stance and perspective, which meant that I had to go and learn from white people, and I had to go and learn from people of color. And then, right, once I've actually formed some accountability relationships, right, where I'm getting active feedback from folks of color about the work that I'm doing, when I'm getting active feedback from racially conscious white folks, then I could start actually seeing how I can be of service in this work, right? So not coming from it of like, oh, I want a job so I can say I facilitate about race, right? It's like, I facilitated about race to be in service of ending racism and white supremacy. So I think that that's a really important piece about white folks who claim to be diversity or DEI folks who haven't done their own work. That's a courageous conversation we have to have more of.
Yeah, yeah. Gladwell did this book, Outliers, and I really use it a lot in thinking about talking with people who want to do this work. And he says that if you're going to be a professional in anything, you need to put in 10,000 hours. And I think that fits right into what you're saying, because I'm wondering, and this is what I want to ask you about. I feel like I'm just wondering, what's your sense if I ask you, in all your experience with particularly white DEI folks out there, are they committed more to coalition or solidarity, community as part of their fuel for the work, or what feels to me like conflict, like tearing people down and being in battle and headlines, and which generates more profit?
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering, what's your sense? Is it about community, or is it about profit?
Well, I think that takes us back to that individualist, collectivist piece that I talked about before. And I think that there are a number of white folks in DEI work who it's about self-promotion, it's about me getting to the next level, it's about me having the bigger audience, right? And so one way for me to do that is to tear down other white folks, right? And as we know in white racial identity development from Dr. Helms, that urge to put myself up by putting other white folks down is a part of building my white racial consciousness, but it's actually allowing racism to exist and persist, right? Because I'm missing, one, the opportunity to build a white collective when I'm just simply tearing white people down and throwing them to the side to just show how much a better white person I am, right? So I'm missing that opportunity. And even worse, I'm allowing racism to persist because I'm not actually helping other white folks interrupt their own racism, nor am I really doing anything to help interrupt my own racism. And I say this with all compassion, because I definitely was in my phase of when I thought being a good anti-racist was about just like tearing white people down. And I had to do some mourning about the racism that I perpetuated by doing that. And in particular, the white people who I drove out of racial justice and social justice, because they're like, well, if I'm going to get treated like that, like I don't have the skills for it, I'm out. And so that to me seems really a really important piece of that shift away from individualism into collectivism. And so that's why I have really worked, and I tell white folks all the time, you have to intentionally build your collective of other white people who you're locking arms with, and you're doing this together. You cannot do this by yourself, and you cannot do it by only having relationships with folks of color. And so that becomes, how do I need to learn what acting more collectively means? And then how do I hold myself in accountability to that? And then how do I have other white people who will do the same for me?
Yeah. Now, you had mentioned the work you and Shelley are doing, which sparked a question about white women and the role of white women in reference to this work over the next, let's just say 25 years, 30 years, we can see ourselves active. What's your sense of the state of the white woman around doing social justice work?
State of the white woman. Uh, well, we have a lot of work to do, right? As we know, 53% of white women voted for this administration. And do a lot of that implicit pushing of white ideology, right supremacist ideology. And so there has to be that reckoning for us in thinking about what is my complicity, right? When do I allow my whiteness to my actual physical whiteness, right? And access to everything that gives me. How do we reckon that? And then how do we actually take action? Again, to go back to that idea of with fidelity. For me personally, it's really, I mean, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but going back to that collective piece, right? So what is my responsibility as a white woman to work with other white women to interrupt the ways that white supremacy will just like call us back in, right? And then I can use sexism and misogyny. Like, okay, let's talk about all that, Becky is as bad as the N-word stuff that came out. Like that's when we're like at our worst as white women, right? Because we want to take our oppression and double down, like reinforce ways that actually we're absolutely benefiting from racism, and using misogyny and sexism as an out. And it's a deep part of our work. And you hear that sigh because I sometimes struggle with how ineffective sometimes I am at calling in other white women. And I'm also how ineffective sometimes I am about seeing my own complicity.
Yeah. Well, if you were, let's say, a 15, 16, ninth grader, 12th grader, even first year, second year college student, young white woman who's interested in the work, what would be your advice to them, to her at this moment as they look at, let's say, the next 10 years of their life? What would be your advice to them? Because they're showing some real signs, some real interest in this being the work that they want to do.
Yeah, I think that that piece is fostering that curiosity and that critical thinking, kind of like what I said about what parents need to do to keep their white young people engaged in responsible ways. So encouraging that, like continuing to foster that flame and making sure that it's burning in the right direction, as well as to find the collectives, right? So, who's your students organizing against racism group at your school, or if it's not at your school, in your community, or can you start one? But finding the groups that already exist that you might be able to tap into, but then also like being empowered to start a group if you need to. But to always go back to that piece of not being the white person who becomes the white savior, not becoming the white person who does this work in a vacuum without accountability to folks of color. So that would be my advice is foster the flame and find your collective or build your collective.
Yeah, appreciate that. So how are you doing during quarantine? I mean, I'm wondering and asking people like, how are you doing? But also, I think this pandemic, COVID-19, has really stopped us in our tracks and given us a chance to kind of almost like look around and see what's going on. So as you've stopped, so to speak, what has COVID-19 or this pause told you about the state of America, where we are, the work we're doing? I mean, what are you reflecting on? What's the time of reflection telling you about the state of the world, the state of America?
Yeah. I think the crisis is obviously escalating the systemic inequities that we already have, right? So I, as a white woman, have that understanding and see, particularly living in Chicago, right? So the disproportionality of Black folks dying in Chicago is pretty unbelievable. Even though I understand the systemic reasons that it's there, just seeing the sheer number it's heartbreaking, right? That's a loss of humanity. Like, families are losing members and members and members, right? And that's not happening to white families in Chicago, right? It's happening to Black predominantly and Latinx, right? Hearing what's happening in Native American communities. And so that's part of that piece of like holding and caring for what it really means to feel connected to other people who are not of my racial identity, and then feeling that responsibility even more to help shape white folks at this time, to not turn it into well, they don't take good care of their health, so that's why they're dying, right? They made bad choices, that's why they're dying, right? That, like, and to interrupt some of the mainstream messages that they're getting that are doubling down on that, right? And so I've really been trying to think about, how do I use my time now to be of service? How do I do some writing to try to build more awareness? How do I make more phone calls to reach out to other people? How do I get involved in the mutual aid efforts in my neighborhood to make sure the Black and brown folks are getting what they need, those who are on the front line? Because that's the other piece, is that so many of our Black and brown community in Chicago are the people who are running the buses and working in the grocery store and working at the pharmacy. And so how to support all of that from a racially conscious place. Quick thing of note, this is something that I've been wrestling with, and I've been trying to talk to more people, because I understand it, and yet I haven't seen anyone tie it all together. But when COVID and sheltering in place first started, kind of at that main level, you go into a white neighborhood in Chicago and like the Whole Foods, everything's gone, right? You saw those pictures, right? Everything is gone. Well, I live in West Rogers Park, and I go to my local grocery market, Cermak Market. The only two things that were gone were ramen noodles and toilet paper. They still had produce. They still had, everything, right? And so that just highlighted for me this question of how the crisis exacerbates the inequities, but it also, because white folks have the means and the ability to opportunity hoard, right? And take all of these resources away from other people. Go back to, I'm going to take care of my family and this part of my collective, right? I don't have a collective, right? And yet in my Black and brown neighborhood, the Black and brown neighborhood in which I live, there's the mutual aid networks, there's places for people to be able to go and get things. And that something about that juxtaposition, I still don't know where it's going to take me, but I'm trying to learn more and think more about what is that also revealing about whiteness and white people, and the ways in which in a crisis we could either be our best self or we can just like revert into, I'm just going to take care of my own. Of course, I don't identify as a white nationalist. Of course, I don't identify. I'm not going to go join a group. And yet all of my behaviors are going to protect white people.
Yeah. I think you raise a good point, and it's something worth shining some light on that I think is missing from the conversation as well. And I'm seeing, and I think it's important to see and understand some of the disparities and inequities that are showing up, particularly around how different communities are being impacted, i.e. communities of color, but no one is talking about the existence and the permanence of whiteness during this time. Like, what is this time doing to white kids, white people, when you're watching and seeing, like you said, not only people's ability to collect like more than they ever need, just in case, but we've seen some folks use this as an opportunity to make capital, like to buy it all and be able to sell it back to people for a profit. And so I think it's it's something we don't have time for, but I do appreciate you raising that because I think it's something worth us continuing to grapple with as we may be experiencing another 30, 60, 90, 120 days if folks are going to adhere to what's the best way to, get out of this situation healthier. So let me ask you about you though. What's on your agenda for the next 10 years? Is there anything cooking? What do you think about as you look at your life and the work you want to do over the next decade? What's in the hopper, so to speak?
Yeah, well, I think for me personally, I definitely want to do more writing and to figure out ways to use the virtual space to connect with more white folks. And so I'm really thinking about that both with adults, right? Kind of continuing the work that I was doing with Courageous Conversations, but also thinking about some of the ways to build what I'm doing with the young people. Like, I'm really excited about this little social justice cohort. And I think I'm going to start a second one for 9 to 11-year-olds. And I think I'm going to start one for high school students. And then could we turn that? Could there be a virtual family social justice camp? And I've been talking to Corey Wallace here about that. Like, there are ways that we can build this into change for good, right? Versus a doubling down on perpetuating the inequities. And so for me, I think that's the exciting piece, and that's really important for me. I will also share that I am an extrovert, and so not being able to like go out and see people and hug people, and like I'm amazed at how much I thought I would be like, oh, it'll be hard, but I didn't actually realize how hard it would be. And so some days that makes me, it's sad, like it's very sad. And so that's why I am one of those people who's on phone calls and Zoom calls and emailing and, because I need that. I need that piece.
Yeah. Well, we want to end on a light note, a fun note. We're collecting. What are you watching? What are you suggesting people watch? What have you watched that's been really good? Maybe something you've learned from, something that just has taken you away. Are there some things you would add to our list that you would suggest people check out as a possible way to spend some time during quarantine, either learning stuff or, hey, just maybe getting away?
Yeah. So I have been using the time to watch some of the shows I hadn't had a chance to see on Netflix. I watched Hensified. Have you seen that one? It's a comedy about the Latinx family in LA.
No, I've seen that on the Netflix offerings, but okay, so that's a good one.
Yeah, that is a good one. I felt it was both really just fun and funny, and the characters are very charming, and it like actually deals with like gentrification and racism and colorism, and so it was like a really nice mix of things. And my next one that I haven't actually started yet is one called Inconvenience. I think something Inconvenience. It's about a Asian family. I think it's actually Canadian, but who run a little grocery store. So that's supposed to be very interesting as well. So that's my next lineup now that I've finished Hensified.
Okay, so have you heard the buzz around this new Kerry Washington and Reese Witherspoon?
Oh, I did watch that. Yes, Little Fires Everywhere.
Yes.
Yeah,
So that's been the one that's been Shaker Heights been consuming my time, but you've heard of that. Great.
Yeah. I've been watching it. It's really good. Did you read the book by chance?
I have not read the book. No, it's a good one?
Yeah, I would definitely recommend the book. And I feel like there's a lot of nice ways in which they're, how adaptations are always a little different, but I think that it's a really nice compliment. But yes, that has been a great show. I'm glad to hear you're watching it.
Yes. In fact, a new episode comes out tonight, so I'll be getting my work done so I can watch a little bit tonight. So fantastic. I'll leave you with one other. I don't know if you've seen this Netflix Unorthodox special.
Oh, I have not started that one yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one that had me kind of reflecting about faith, religion, assimilation from a different lens, of course, but I really enjoyed that, if that's the right term, but
Yeah,
it was stirring in some ways, but also freeing and revealing. So that's another one I've been recommending. But you've given us two that we haven't heard from or haven't heard from others. So thank you for adding to our list. Thank you for
absolutely.
joining us for Coffee with the Founder. It's so good to connect with you. Like you, I miss hugging my friends and family as well. So I'm going to send you a Wakanda virtual hug for now. We appreciate your time, and stay safe, take care of yourself, and I'll look forward to seeing you hopefully face to face soon, but we'll be in touch.
I hope so. Love to the family, Eddie, and stay safe.
All right,
Thank
peace.
you for all that you do. Bye. Be well.
I
Bye.
appreciate you.